Good evening, everybody. I'm just pouring the holy water, and then I'll be with you. I feel incredibly privileged to be allowed to cross-examine Timothy Garton Ash because he's a biblical figure who has written acres of the most extraordinarily insightful material over the years. He's not only the most brilliant analyst and observer, somebody who lives the work he writes, witnesses the things he sees and writes very lyrically about them, but he's also a decent cove. But in addition to that, a rare thing amongst academics and journalists alike, and writers alike, he's an idealist. And there's very few idealists knocking around any longer. And having been so nice to him, I'm now going to tear him limb from limb. Even a canter through the index of this book will reveal that he wanders, obviously, through Europe, to America, around the world. And he wanders into the intellectual, thinking about all sorts of other influences on our lives. But I want to start him off in Europe because, I think conceivably he may have some apologies to make. You see, I remember the day the wall came down. I was in the Unter den Linden. It's before the period of this book begins, but it informs the book, obviously. I mean, the coming down of the wall was a dramatic thing, which we're still kind of sorting out right now. And I remember saying to my cameraman, I was on the East German side of the wall. I was in East Berlin, and we were in the Unter den Linden. And I said to him, my dear chap, this was on the very day it came down. I said, do you realize that within the next 10 years, these two countries could be one country, and within 6 weeks they were, or 10, or whatever it was. It was very, very quick anyway. And it may have been too quick.
Right.
And of course, you were a tremendous fan of obviously, of unification, of the whole expansion of Europe eastwards.
Yes.
And I'm going to argue, as I attempt to turn off my telephone, because having come here in a huge hurry from wherever I was trying to do Channel 4 News, I have not had a chance to get into the technology of my iPhone to switch it off, which is almost impossible to do, I might say. Button on the left, that's interesting. The top one? The top one? You give it to him and tell him to turn it off. I've only had it a week, and I've been wondering all week how you turn it off. So, quite seriously, I mean, I'm an idealist too, in the privacy of these walls. Don't tell anyone outside, but I'm passionately pro-European, like you, and I believed passionately in deepening before widening. Mrs. Thatcher believed in widening because she was convinced it would trash Europe, and it has.
No. Were you there for the 20th anniversary?
No.
In Berlin?
No.
Which was the most fantastic and moving occasion. 9th November in Berlin, this amazing scene with the huge polystyrene dominoes, which you probably saw on telly, which Lech Wałęsa got to hit the first domino, and then the Hungarians got to hit. And this fantastic scene. It was amazing, and it worked. These were German dominoes. They were not, they were not Polish dominoes, which have gone all over the place. And it was the most incredible celebration. And to think, for the first time ever in European history, that most of Europe is in the same union. Most countries in Europe are liberal democracies. They're reasonably well off. They're reasonably secure. Almost nobody is frightened of Germany anymore, except possibly the Germans themselves a little. I mean, this is a fantastic, fantastic achievement. And if the choice were between that and your right tight little Belgian Europe, a sort of miniature, a little Europe, a mini European Union, headed by Mr. Van Rompuy, then I would rather have the larger Europe any day.
But you've got Mr. Van Rompuy. He is the president of Europe, and that surely epitomizes exactly where Europe is.
Well, I think there is this difference between the European Union and the United States, which is that so far as I know, the United States hasn't got any bigger for some time, but the European Union has and can. That's to say, it is actually a source of European power, that we've got a whole lot bigger. So for me personally, this is an extraordinarily moving, it's a huge success story. What has happened over the last 20 to 30 years.
Bigger, your take obviously is absolutely right, and it's a wonderful thing that these countries are free and the rest of it. But weaker, actually, they may be stronger, these outlying Eastern Bloc countries. They're individually democratized and thrusting forward,
No,
but they're in an awful lot of trouble, some of them.
Actually, I mean, I don't think that's right. And the connection is a different one. I mean, you have a point, but it's not the point you think you have.
I hope you're going to unravel that.
Let me explain. Actually, the European Union as such doesn't work that much worse with 27 members than it did with 15, remarkably. Okay? But it is true that there's not the sort of the huge energy going into European integration and unification. And what's the reason for this? Not that we have so many more members, because actually the East Europeans are often very enthusiastic members, but because of Germany, which is the central power of Europe. And for 40 years until 1989, Germany was the motor of European integration. Everyone says France and Germany. Actually, it was Germany which was driving it forward, because Germany wanted to be European, but also had to be European if it was going to win the trust of its neighbors and get reunited. And now it doesn't have to be. And what's really changed is the German attitude to Europe, which is much more skeptical, much happier in talking about national interests, not at all willing to bail out Greece, not at all willing to put its money on the line. And that, I think, is a big change. So there you do have a choice. But given the choice between East Germany and therefore the rest of Eastern Europe remaining unfree for another 40 years, and a larger, in many ways stronger, but a bit less dynamic Europe, I'd still choose the Europe we've got.
But I'm suggesting, or I was in my first question, that you panicked, that everybody wanted it faster than it was sensible to deliver it,
Well,
that there was no real threat to its happening. We imagined a threat because we'd lived with the often imagined threat for 40 years.
I totally disagree. First of all, imagine that you hadn't got German unification in the bag, and you'd had the August 91 coup in Moscow, and maybe that coup had been more successful. You simply had the coup, and Gorbachev would be much weakened. Could you have got German unification on the terms that Helmut Kohl got it in 1990? I doubt it very much. I think Kohl actually is one of the great unsung heroes of our time. I think he was one of the most neglected figures of last year's celebration. As for Eastern Europe, John, it took 15 years from 1989, the end of communism in Poland, to Poland joining the European Union. That's not my definition of a hurry.
Well, but then you see, you look at Latvia, for example, absolutely on its knees, in debt and deficit. Greece. Now, Greece is not part of the Eastern Bloc, I agree, but Greece should never have been allowed to enter the Eurozone in the way it did, and probably shouldn't have been allowed. Look at Cyprus. Why the hell was that allowed to become a member of the European Union when it still hasn't reached peace with another NATO country?
What about Britain?
Britain? Well, I mean, there you're talking, aren't you? I mean, I think if we'd had deepening, I would argue with you that if we'd had deepening, Britain would inexorably have had to make the final great choice between the other side of the Atlantic and the heartland of Europe. It would have been forced to make that choice.
So you're really a little European, are you?
No, I'm a big European. I actually think that what Europe needed, and You're not interviewing me, I'm interviewing you. I think that if you'd had a strong heart, much stronger than it was, a much better organized union, before these people all became members, we'd have been better placed to take on the real world, which is the new China, the new India, the new Brazil, the BRICS. And the BRICS, in truth, don't figure hugely in your book.
Brazil is in there, Russia is in there.
Well, they make appearances.
Wait for the next decade, okay. I mean, you know, look.
Well, I must admit, I'm flushed with having been on my very first trip to Brazil.
Yes. Actually, Brazil is in there.
I know it's in there, and it's a beautifully written piece, there's no question. I mean, but they're on the go. All these people are really moving at the speed of light.
Okay, let's just go around this one more time. I mean, first of all, for me, what really matters most is, and I put this very, very simply, that people should be free, and more people should be free. So for me, the fact that the Poles and the Hungarians and the Czechs and now the Serbs and the Croatians and many, many more are free, whereas when I started traveling in those parts, they were living these miserable conditions, is itself a fantastic success. And even if it were true, which it isn't, that Europe were weakened as a result, I would still think it was worth it. Secondly, your model, if I may put it that way, could not have worked a la longue, because it wasn't the West that pushed the Berlin Wall down. It was the people from the East who pulled the Berlin Wall down. And they wouldn't have waited another 20 years while we got on and made our United States of Europe around Benelux and France and Germany. They would not have waited. So we had to do that business. Now we face, and here I totally agree with you, I think the story of the next 20 years is about the challenge of China above all. By the way, I don't believe in the BRICS. I believe in China, India, South Africa, and Brazil, the basics. I think Russia is a weakening regional power, right? It's a challenge of the...
Let's challenge that.
Okay, but it's a challenge of these huge emerging great powers. And that is the question to us Europeans. And we have responded feebly. I mean, let's be polite about Mr. Van Rompuy and Cathy Ashton. I like the letter in the Daily Telegraph which said Tintin and Mrs. Tiggywinkle would have more impact on the world stage. I mean, I think that's about right. We've responded feebly, but that is the challenge of our time. Yeah.
Well, let's quickly visit Russia, because first of all, the fantastic power stranglehold they have, energy power stranglehold they have on Western Europe. Another pipeline opened to this very day, direct from Russia into the Baltic seas, bypassing Ukraine and the rest of it. But let's make no mistake, Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia soon, very much back in the orbit of Russian influence.
Well, first of all, I think that China, the rise of China, is the great global story of our time. And I think Russia is a regional story. And I really do believe that.
You've knocked me down on that.
And I think that, you know, the demography of Russia is disastrous. Male life expectancy shrinking population.
That's also our hope in China. Because they're going to be pretty old by 2020.
Give it a bit of time. But one of the essays I have in this book is two of the essays are very enthusiastic accounts of the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And there are quite a few velvet revolutions in the book, including that. And people now say, oh yeah, but look what happened. You know, the defeated Yanukovych of the Orange Revolution, the man we all laughed out of court, he's back as president. That is true. But he's back as president in a free and fair election, completely unlike that in 2004. He's back as president in a country which clearly wants to remain independent. It's not going back to Russia anytime soon. And where does he make his first foreign trip? Yanukovych, Russia's man, Putin's man, to Brussels, not to Moscow. So I still think that actually the direction of history, even in the Russian, and also in Belarus in time, is towards Europe, not away from it.
Your excitement over freedom, does it embrace Azerbaijan? Does it go beyond Turkey? Does it include Turkey?
Absolutely it does.
So it'll take in a whole lot of stans?
Yes, you see,
How far does it go? Hit China?
Absolutely it does. Doesn't yours?
Well, I'm sort of a bit out of steam, I must admit. I'm kind of worried that we've got a bit puffed getting as far as we have. I'm certainly Turkey. I mean, in fact, we can't survive without Turkey. We need their labor above anything else.
So I'll tell you what I think. I think that the European Union has to stop somewhere. If it's everywhere, it will be nowhere. So it can't go on forever. That's for sure.
Well, what is the logical stop?
Oh, well, interestingly enough, I think the logical stop, I mean, I think Ukraine and Belarus are clearly European. Okay, so here's the story. Europe does not end. It merely fades away. It fades away across Russia and across Turkey. There's a European side of the Bosporus, where you're clearly in Europe, and then somewhere in Anatolia or going on towards, you're moving across to Asia, and the same is true of Russia. So these are two special cases, which if I was starting from scratch, would not be members of the European Union, right? That's where it would end, because that's logical, because then you have a kind of cultural and historical unity. But for more than 40 years, we've been promising Turkey, you will be a member of our union. Suddenly to turn around now and say we renege on all our promises because Europe is a Christian club and you're Muslims and we can't have you in, that would send a disastrous message. So for me, Turkey is a special case. But I would stop there.
What about Morocco?
Not the Maghreb, not Morocco. Okay, what follows from that is that we have to get away from a prejudice which has been around in Europe for hundreds of years, if not thousands, which is it's better to be European than to be something else, right? That's what we've always thought. Therefore, it really matters that you become part of Europe because that's better. Now, I would like to be in a world in which it's just as good to belong to an Asian union or an African union. In other words, where Europe is deprived of this assumption of superiority. So that's the answer to the freedom question.
Let's cross the Atlantic, because you were called in by Obama. You describe it very nicely.
By Bush, yeah.
By Bush, yes.
Yeah.
But you also met Obama.
I did, yeah.
You've been called in by a number of people, I mean, both sides of the Atlantic over time. And I like the way you describe how you retain your integrity, having, you know, as it were, run into the danger of soiling your integrity by advising various people who turn out to be rather less than perfect. But it's good. It's good. I mean, there's no question it doesn't damage anybody to go and talk to them. But you talk to Bush, and you describe him rather nicely in the book, and you also describe Obama nicely. Tell us about Bush.
I mean, because this...
Did he turn out worse than you imagined?
But you know, someone wonderfully said, who knew him quite well, people think two things about George W. Bush, that he's stupid and that he's nice. Neither are true. And that was my impression. I mean, he's clearly not an intellectual. I mean, let me just tell you the story, which is described in the book, which is that in early 2001, I got a call in my office in Oxford, and this sort of rather light, girlish American voice said, Professor Garton Ash, could you come to tell the President about Europe in the White House next Thursday at 1:45? She said, I should tell you we'll pay a coach class airfare. And I thought this was some kind of student hoax. It took a minute or two to check it out. And then I said, well, you know, I do have a lunch, but I'll try and move it. And, off we went. There were 5 of us. We had 2.5 hours with Bush. It was an extraordinary conversation before his first official trip to Europe. Cheney was there. Condi Rice was there. And I mean, he sure as hell was ignorant. That's for sure. He had made up his mind about only 2 things, basically. One was missile defense, and the other was climate change. He said, Kyoto is mush. Kyoto is mush, and he said, forgive my language, he said, basically, I think the Europeans are trying to screw us. These were the two things he'd made his mind up about. Apart from that, he hadn't got any idea of where he, this is before 9/11. If he had any sense of sort of his picture of the world, it was, over there is China. And China is the great new threat. This is, as it were, the new Soviet Union, and everything is going to be.
Well, of course, it was one of the rare countries he'd actually been to.
Well, that's right, and they'd just done, there'd been the airline incident and so on. Islamist terrorists did not get a single mention. It was just fascinating. So here was a man, not stupid, not nice, ignorant, but groping for a narrative. 9/11 gave him that narrative. And then everything changed. Fundamentally, this is the Fourth World War, and off we go. And much of this book is about the damage that did, which I think is incalculable. I mean, what I argue in the book is that this decade, which I refuse to call the noughties, I on no account, actually lasted from the 11th of September 2001, 9/11, to the 4th of November 2008, the election of Obama, which I witnessed in Washington. Incredible moment. And so it was, the 1990s were a long decade. They went from 89 to 2001. This was quite a short decade, and it was absolutely shaped by arguably the most powerful country in world history, because you could well argue the United States in 2001 was the most powerful any single country has been at any point in world history, screwing up in an extraordinary fashion. I mean, the extent to which that shaped the whole decade, I think, can't be overstated.
Well, I too was in Washington when Obama was elected. I was at Howard University,
right,
and I was the only white man in the room, a room of 2,000 people. Have you reevaluated? Are you reevaluating?
Well, first of all, there's an account which John will recognize in the book of that night in Washington. And I mean, they can't take that away from us. No. It was fantastic. So when the news came through that he'd won, I went down to the White House, and people were dancing in front of the White House. They were beating saucepans. They were honking their horns,
of all
saying,
races.
Yes, we can. Of every race and mixture of race under the sun. It was the greatest party in the world. And actually, there was a wonderful moment, which I must tell you, because it contained a fantastic rebuke. There was a guy there who was kind of shimmying in fantastic style in front of the White House. Just great. And he looked to me sort of North African, Maghrebian. I thought he might be Muslim. So, of course, I went in and asked the obvious question, which is, where are you from? The obvious journalist question. And he stopped for a moment, and he looked at me and just said, from my mother. And then he carried on talking. Great rebuke. Perfect answer. That's exactly where you want to be. You want to be in a society where everyone just says, where are you from? I'm from my mother. So I love that. So the hope of that moment was fantastic. I have to say, the hope of him transforming the world has been hugely disappointed so far, it seems to me. I mean, it is difficult to point. Maybe you can help me, but I can't point to a single unambiguous success in foreign policy.
Well, I think he's defined the limits of power, hasn't he? That's the first thing. He said, I want to close Guantanamo. I don't doubt at all that he wants to close down Guantanamo, but he can't.
Right.
Because it's been so structured by the whole system that it's unclosable.
I mean, I think that's right, and I think what we've discovered is just how dysfunctional the American system of government has come. But also, if you look at Russia, if you look at Iran, if you look at China, if you look at Afghanistan, there's not yet a single obvious success that he's scored.
But what a sublime opening it was to Iran. You know, the unclenched fist. the admission that it had been clenched all this time. You know, it was a beautiful thing for anyone who studies, or doesn't study, I've never studied anything, but anybody who oiks around in Iran, it was a very, very beautiful moment. And unfortunately, totally underestimated what it would take to grasp the open hand of friendship.
I mean, I think there is a problem there. I mean, both John and I have spent time in Iran and talked about it several times. And if you haven't been there, maybe not just at the moment, but do go.
No, even at the moment. Even at the moment, you can go to Isfahan and places, you know, there's still carpet tiles.
It will immediately get under your skin. It's the most amazing, amazing place. And I talked there's a few years back, to these absolutely incredible, half the population is, I think, under 30. I think it's about half, isn't it? Masses also of women have been to university. You doubtless talked to them. I spent lots of my time talking to them. And my conclusion was the revolution may be devouring its children, but the grandchildren will devour the revolution. And, you know, they've started already. One of these women said to me, there is only one power on earth that can save this regime, and that's the United States, by bombing us. So whatever you do, please don't bomb us. So I think that was great. But to subordinate your Russia policy and your China policy to trying to get additional sanctions on Iran, which in my view are simply not going to work, that doesn't seem to me very clever.
Incredible to have a one-trick pony. I mean, that is the only thing they have in the locker.
Truly, and I think you'd agree with me. It's very unlikely to work. And you know, Russia's an important country. China's a very important country. I mean, our own dear Foreign Secretary is, at this moment, or in the last couple of days, off in Beijing, doing Washington's business. And Washington's business is get Chinese support for sanctions on Iran, which are not going to work. I don't think this is
which they won't achieve.
Exactly.
The Chinese are not going to give up 11% of their oil supply.
So I don't think this is smart foreign policy. And I think actually one of the things that we have to work out is how we play a long game, including supporting democratic movements like the Green Movement Iran, which, because they're mainly non-violent and are up against very nasty people, are initially defeated. That's what happens to these movements. You know, Solidarity was crushed in 81, but it won in 89. So how do you play the long game of supporting these movements?
I'm going to throw it open to the floor very soon, but I just wanted to come back to Britain. Because the extraordinarily confused role that Britain has played in the last, well, in this decade in particular, where's it going to go? I mean, not closer to, if, for example, the Conservatives are elected, this will be the most Eurosceptic administration ever elected in Britain.
A man called Peter Clarke wrote a history of Britain in the 20th century. And he said at the end of the 20th century, the biggest question in British politics was our relationship to the European Union. A matter, he said, which could not remain unresolved long into the 21st century. Here we are, 10 years into the 21st century. We're still as ambivalent and dithering as ever.
And it's still 16th on the list of people's interests.
And we will go on like this for another 10 years. I mean, I have to tell you, I feel that it's Groundhog Day. You know, one wakes up and it's the same old ding-dong on the Today program. The same old arguments are wheeled out. And I feel I could hibernate for 10 years and I would come back and the British would still be having the same ludicrous European argument. And I can't believe we are so stupid, because this comes back to the beginning of our conversation. When the Constitutional Treaty was defeated in the referendum in France, a French socialist wrote in a cry of despair, so what we have is l'Europe anglaise. What we're going to get is a British Europe. And he was right. We have got a British Europe. The only people who don't realize this are the British. And it's so, why are we being so stupid?
And that's the point at which we disagree. Because Europe, I believe that the Europe the British wanted was a Europe designed to fail in the ideal that it was forged in.
Right, but be that as it may, if we've got it, then we should welcome it and get in there. I mean, to be keeping our, you know, a British Europe at arm's length and dithering about it. I mean, let me just tell you, William Hague, that great Euro enthusiast, I heard him give a talk the other day, and he said, look at the figures for GDP. By mid-century, China will be maybe 30 to 40% of world GDP, the United States at 20%, the whole of Europe somewhere between 5 and 10%. How do you expect Britain to exert any influence on the world, this famous phrase, to punch above our weight, if the whole of Europe only has 5% of GDP? So he's made the argument.
One last question before I open to the floor. Didn't you see that, in a sense, brought home at Copenhagen? Didn't you see the evaporation of European power and the coming of the New World Order?
Absolutely you did. Absolutely you did. When, as you know better than me, the essential deal was made between the Americans, the Chinese, and the basics, the Indians, South African, Brazil. And Europe was nowhere.
It's a great story because now the Indians and others are now telling us. I mean, Zuma spelt out, we asked him the other, we had a briefing with him, and he told us exactly what happened in that meeting with Obama and how he came into the room in order to have his bilateral with the Chinese and said, oh, well, you folks are all here as well. Why don't we just get on and do it? And they stitched up this sort of sludge.
Exactly.
Amazing. And we were nowhere. There was not a single European in the room. And nor, in a funny sort of way, should there have been.
Right. We hadn't ended.
No. Well, that's a pretty gloomy end to the initial part. The worst is over. It's now your turn. So would anybody like to start the ball rolling? We've covered a lot of things where we've offered a few sticks to be thrown. Otherwise, I'm going to keep going. Yes, far away.
Somebody who looks forward to Thursday mornings in the Guardians and Tim Garton Ash's pieces. I don't want to challenge you exactly, but just to ask you a little bit more about the freedoms that followed the fall of the wall in 1989, and in particular about those nations that joined the enlarged European Union in the early 90s, in the early sort of noughties or whatever we're going to call them, namely the Baltic states, namely Poland, and could well be Ukraine if it does eventually become part of Europe. Under the communist empire, under the Soviet empire, a lot of extreme right elements in Central and Eastern Europe were frozen in the ice over that 40-year period. Since the fall of the wall, and particularly since the enlargement of the EU, those extreme right elements have emerged again, and in some cases they've emerged in a very ugly way. How are we going to deal with that in this new enlarged Europe?
Well, as you know, the Conservatives are dealing with it by going into partnership with them in the European Parliament, which is one way of dealing with it, or at least with some of them, like the Latvian Fatherland and Freedom Party, or the Polish Law and Justice Party. You know, I mean, of course you're right, but then that's what happens when countries become free. Everything comes out, the good, the bad, and the ugly. That's bound to be the case. I'm actually, I think many of these countries, certainly the ones I know best, have come through very nasty periods of sort of xenophobic and anti-Semitic agitation. And with the exception of Hungary, which I'm extremely worried about, Hungary, which has a very nasty, more or less fascist party, Jobbik, and one of the largest still existing, flourishing Jewish communities in Europe. I mean, that's a very worrying case. But with that exception, I think these countries have a far right, which, you know, is I'm afraid, somewhere in the European norm, which is somewhere between 10 to 15%. I mean, Le Pen has just got close to 12% in France. The BNP is doing quite well here. I'm afraid that's a continent we're in, actually.
And you're not worried about Poland?
No, no, definitely not. I think that the Polish right is a hell of a lot more sensible than it was 10 years ago, when it was truly, you know, around the famous controversy around the revelation of Jedwabne, which was a small town where in 1941, basically the Polish half of the village killed the Jewish half of the village. And then there was lots of nasty stuff came out of the woodwork, but I think it's actually got better.
You should have been on deck to help poor old Stephen Fry on Channel 4 News when he, do you know what I'm referring to?
I do indeed. He got himself into a little...
Well, I mean, he said Polish Catholics had killed...
He did.
Jews.
He did. A view that one still encounters rather too often, I think, actually. But then he rather wonderfully, if I remember rightly, tweeted to say I should keep my trap shut.
Anybody else? Yes.
A question of someone from the former Soviet Union, from the Soviet Union. Two questions, actually. One about the dangers of Russia, still, I think, felt in Eastern Europe, and I would think rightly so, especially after the Georgian War. So how do you assess that? And the second question about the Lisbon Treaty, the Constitution, and as some people point out, the dangers of the European Union getting into the Soviet Union model. I mean, I'm not comparing, but the centralization and all these things that people are worried about. So I would like your point of view on that.
Right. Well, I mean, obviously, we keep saying we've had peace in Europe, there's no war in Europe, and then we keep having wars in Europe. I mean, many people in this room will have had some experience with the Balkans in the 1990s. And we had wars in Europe to the very last year of the 20th century, 4 Balkan wars. Then we have a war in Georgia. So the idea that we've just banished war from the European continent is never going to happen is for the birds. We have no operational defense plans in NATO for the Baltic states. There are absolutely none. Actually, making those plans has been balked by Germany and some other countries in NATO. It's quite an interesting story. So I think there is, you know, there's a serious point there. I mean, I think it would take a lot before Russia actually made a move against the Baltics, but elsewhere in the former Soviet Union, I would be worried. That doesn't contradict my earlier answer about Russia being a regional problem rather than a global one, which is why we need a European foreign policy. Because throughout the Cold War, it was America's problem, and America was going to deal with it for us.
Well, we also need a European army, therefore.
Well, I think we need a European security policy, I mean, and a rapid reaction force. I'm not sure you need 1 million men under arms.
Well, God knows NATO has rendered itself completely past its sell-by date, hasn't it?
Well, I mean, I think that NATO is still capable of being a European, although part of the European security system.
But you can't get heavy lift without hiring it from Ukraine or telling the Americans to do it.
Yeah, well, that's fine.
Well, I mean, but that speaks, in a sense, volumes about Europe's capacity, for example, to defend its own member states. I mean, you talk about the threat of Russia on Latvia, for example, but the truth is, it's not NATO that should be planning a response to that, but the member states. Yeah. I mean, I think NATO would be capable of doing that. I mean, there are other places where Europe is not good at fighting wars, because that's one of the things we've decided we don't want to do, right? So I don't think you could, wouldn't want to see
the European Union becoming a military superpower like the United States, and I don't think most Europeans want to. But defending ourselves, yes. On the Lisbon Treaty, we've in a sense talked about that before, which is the idea that you have this juggernaut of a federal European superstate coming down the tracks towards you is 20 years out of date. It's simply not the way things are going. What you do have is a lot of petty bureaucracy. There's no question about that. The Brussels bureaucracy, though small, makes up for it by being unbelievably bureaucratic. Anyone who's done a grant application to the EU knows that. So I mean, there is a problem with sort of intrusive, stupid regulation and bureaucracy.
More questions. Lindsay.
Tim, given the rise of China and the success of authoritarian capitalism around the world, particularly in Africa and Asia, people look at China and think, well, that's pretty good. They're doing very well. The problems that there have been in places like Ukraine and so on, do you think that the era of velvet revolutions is over? Those were of a particular time after the fall of the wall, and that time has now gone.
It's a great question. And the good part of the book is about this, because let's not forget that the decade started with the greatest European war criminal of our time, Slobodan Milosevic, being toppled by a velvet revolution with hardly a shot, I mean, hardly any force used. That's an amazing story. And Ukraine was an amazing story. Since then, in the second half of the decade, we've had the pushback. Starts with Belarus, where there was an attempted velvet revolution. It was going to be called the White Revolution. Didn't get very far. All perfectly scripted, all the NGOs lined up, all the Western correspondents, including us, who'd written about 10 velvet revolutions already, waiting to go and tell that story in a certain way. And Lukashenko turned it. He turned it with his own resources. Then you had Burma, which was an attempted velvet revolution in very difficult circumstances. One of the most non-violent of the lot, incredibly moving. All those monks turned. Now we have Iran, also in a way an attempted velvet revolution. So clearly it's getting more difficult in those countries, partly because dictators can learn from history too. And Putin, I mean, the Iranian regime explicitly identifies the threat as velvet revolution. They use the term manufactured in the West, and they've learned how to fight it. So I think it's got more difficult, but I do not think it's the end of velvet revolution by any means. It's leapfrog. We learn, they learn, we learn. In addition, I think some of the new information technologies actually, I mean, Twitter does not of itself set you free. No one has been liberated by a tweet any more than email or the internet or the fax did. I remember reading an article in a French journal about 25 years ago which said, "Le fax vous rendra libre." Well, the fax didn't set anyone free, but it sure as hell helps. And I think that Hillary Clinton, we talked about Obama, Hillary is onto a very good thing with this global internet freedom initiative. I mean, so far the Chinese regime has proved you can keep the lid on it if you put enough resources into controlling it. You know it better than anyone. But with relatively small expenditure in evasion technologies, workaround technologies, satellite technologies, and so on, you can up the ante so that all but the richest and most powerful dictatorship can't beat it. So in the long run, I'm quite optimistic.
Tim, I have another question. I think I agree with you that the best thing in the foreign policy of Obama has been the non-bombing of Tehran. But how do we help the people in Iran? Because I was both in the States and in Poland, and I got better advice from Polish people for the Iranians than from the Americans. You know.
Great question. Anna Husarska, by the way, is a veteran Polish journalist who wrote about solidarity in Poland and then about almost every, as she puts it, shithole around the world since. I really, let's spend a moment on that. I mean, the stuff I'm surest of is communications. So BBC Persian is one of the best things we've done. And I say we, and it's important it's the BBC. The Americans wasted $70 million doing something totally ineffective. Global internet freedom, communications, not supplying internet censorship technologies, which is what Siemens Nokia famously did to the Iranian regime and Cisco to the Chinese. That stuff I'm really confident of. At the other end, not sending dollars to the opposition with their names on it and saying we really want the opposition to win, because that's the worst thing you could do for them. So I'm sure of that. Right, okay, that's the worst thing you could do for them. So the interesting question then comes, what can you do in between? And here the difficulty is that I can tell you a lot of long-term things, like getting tens of thousands of Iranian students out to study in the West and bring them to free countries anywhere, bring them to study in free countries for 3 or 4 years and then send them back. One of the things we did in the Cold War, very important, right? I think telling people how to organize nonviolent resistance, how to organize democratic opposition, telling them how it was done in other places. That's pretty helpful. But short term, today, it's a very difficult one. I don't have a good answer. Maybe someone in the room does. Maybe you do.
I would venture a minority view, and that is we should engage at every possible level. That means trade, top to bottom, carpet bomb them with laptops, you know.
Right.
I mean, I can't see, I believe that that regime would be brought down by material development.
Okay, so, I mean...
Pumps for the oil fields, the lot, everything.
I mean,
Boeings.
I think that's exactly what we should have done 10 years ago. And I think it's a disaster when Clinton, against his better judgment, got himself maneuvered into sanctions. So I don't think Ahmadinejad would be there. Khamenei might still be there, but I don't think Ahmadinejad would be there if we'd done that. What we at the time used to call offensive détente. Yeah, détente is not defensive, an offensive détente. I think it's much more difficult to do now when the regime has been killing people and is locking them up, because it's rather difficult to say, we are supporting you, you political prisoner, by embracing Mr. Ahmadinejad.
Well, I mean, the point really sure is that all we're seeing is it more clearly than we've ever seen it before, but it's been there throughout. The Evin has been in the most appalling torture chamber, more or less from day one. They more or less made a seamless transfer from the Shah to the Islamic Revolution.
Right, but if you'd done it under Khatami, if you'd taken the openings from Khatami when there was a reformist from president, I mean, I completely agree with you on that. I would...
Even under Khatami, the whole stuff was still going on. The
right.
dark practices were still there in the bushes.
Right, but not on the scale.
No.
Not whether you hadn't had a green movement on the streets. But I mean, I do think this set of questions is amongst the most important things we face. And listen, this is the stuff Europe should be doing. We're not good at invading countries and occupying them.
But the point surely about Europe...
the United States is good at either.
But Europe has been disgraceful on Iran in just the same way it's been disgraceful on Iraq and Afghanistan. It simply sings the American tune.
Well,
why has Europe gone along with America on Iran? A country with which America's almost had no serious engagement, ever.
Right.
It's had an embassy there for 20 years, and that's it. And that was a long time ago.
Because Europe doesn't have a foreign policy but every European country has a commercial policy.
But it's had the +3 or whatever it is. I mean, the whatever our element of the negotiations is.
But again and again, if you want to see the European Union at its worst, look at it from Beijing, Moscow, or Washington. If you want to see us at our most weak, divided, and hypocritical, look at it from a big, powerful country. And what they see, and indeed Iran sees, is people making these grand statements about European values and human rights, we're great at that, and then sneaking in through the back door and saying, please give us that contract and not the French. And that's what we all do. So it's a powerful argument for getting our act together. But I just want to say also, no one has more experience of velvet revolution, of transitions to democracy that actually work, than Europe. I mean, that is the story of Europe not since 1989, since the Portuguese Revolution of the Carnations in 1974, and the end of the Franco regime, and the end of the colonels in Greece. I mean, we are the world leaders in this. To see it as our job to export that know-how, to promote that in the world, I mean, that's something I think we should obviously be doing.
Well, I wanted to do one thing, which was to say, I simply want to mark the fact that we've got to 50 minutes into this discussion, and Israel has not been mentioned. And, you know, I mean, in a sense, you can't talk about Iran without talking about Israel. Yeah. And you can't talk about Israel without talking about America. And we're at a most extraordinary moment right now, this very day, in which America has probably had one of the biggest slaps in the face diplomatically by Israel in history. In history. And we've actually seen, and Lindsay recorded it for us tonight, we've seen American foreign policy on Israel veer from, what was the word she used last night? Insulting. To today's emollient, we have the closest relationship it's possible to have with another country. Yeah. You know, Israel's security is our security, ... Is there any potential in your book, not this book, but the next one, the next 10 years, that will bring about a realistic friendship? Friendship, because sure as hell, what America has with Israel is not friendship, it's enslavement. Friendship would have delivered Israel a much better deal. Is there any prospect of America detaching itself from this obsessive yes man position over Israel?
Well, what I think you can see is two things. I mean, firstly, that Obama understands it. I think you can see from, I mean, he's very, very cautious in what he said in public. He was very cautious in the election campaign. But I think, you know, in sort of private conversations with people in the administration, you get a sense that they understand it.
You're one of us. You imbue him with these views. But we can't actually point to a moment when he's said any words.
Because
although the Cairo speech was fabulous.
American foreign policy is made as much in Congress as in the White House. And this is one of the biggest problems, not just of America, but of the world today. You look at the World Trade Talks, you look at climate change, you look at nuclear disarmament, any of the big issues, China, it's the problem in the Congress. And this comes back to this point about the dysfunctional government. So that I think that something has to change in congressional politics, i.e. in the general political debate in the United States, before any president, Democratic or Republican, is going to dare to take it on. That's what I actually think.
I've got two questions in the front row. First, three questions. One there. Very dominant row, this.
Hello. It's just a small question following up from this directly, actually, because it was mentioned earlier that you met Barack Obama. Yeah. Could you give a sense of your impression of him?
Well, I mean, it wasn't, I have to say, it was not like the 2.5 hours with Bush, the very brief reading, but I am completely wowed by him. I think he's a delight always to watch, to listen to, and I think one of his qualities is his understanding of complexity. That after the Bush years, which were all about the oversimplification of the world, this is someone who is sort of finding ways of explaining to the Americans the complexity of things. And that, I think, is hugely attractive. But as I say, and we were both saying it, I wish he was a bit more effective at the dark arts, at arms twisting, because if you compare him with FDR, you know, the great hero in a way, FDR bloody well knew how to get the job done and which arms to twist, and he wasn't above the dark arts at all, and he got the job done in a way I think Obama is not proving very good at. But maybe his second term will be better. Clinton's first term wasn't very good either.
I've got a very dominant faction on the front row. I'm going to go one here, then there, and then back. Yeah.
Well, yes, an American voice coming in. Your comments, Timothy, about Obama. Clinton and Carter are wiped out in the first term.
Can you speak right into the mic?
He's got David Axelrod there. Obama has to get a second term, and if he gets a second term, Israel will be resolved. I mean, I've heard people inside. I mean, Obama doesn't even want to sit down with Netanyahu. I mean, he doesn't want to ever see him again, basically. But my question, actually, which extends slightly from what Lindsay was saying, there's a huge irony over this conversation because all of us here worked for Samizdat, we work for freedom, we agree with what you're saying, but we have a one-party system in China. And China is not only the strongest economy in the world, it's also got a one-party system, and it's working better than the American system. So if the American system gets to a second term, do you think democracy is going to stack up very well against a one-party system, whether it's communist or not? Because they're actually able to run their world better than we're able to run our world. I mean, how does democracy really look against a one-party system if you compare it to China?
Well,
did everybody get that?
So the question was, Chinese authoritarian capitalism looking increasingly good as a competitor and effective as a competitor. I actually think this is, and I think I said it earlier, the great story of our time. I mean, a lot of people for the last 10 years have been saying the defining story of our time is Islamism, Islamist terrorism. I think that's a real threat, just as the IRA was a real threat. I think it'll go on for some time. I think it's serious in Europe. But I don't think it's the big historical story of our time, whereas I really do think the rise of China, which I feel in my bones will continue to rise, to become a superpower, to rival the United States, is this, you know, I mean, I don't think Napoleon actually said, when China awakes, it will shake the world. It's one of those, you know, Loch Ness monsters of quotations, but it's true, it is shaking the world. Now, and I also think that people in, say, Africa or Latin America are beginning to do what you were just talking about. They're beginning to say, well, particularly after this crisis of capitalism, and look at the mess America is in, and maybe the Chinese model is not so bad after all. However, I think that Karl Marx has a message of hope for us all. Because what Karl Marx said was, when you get a bourgeoisie, when you get a wealthy middle class, they start to want to protect their interests. And initially they want property rights. And then they want their own organizations. And eventually they want political parties to defend their interests. Now, the beauty of China is that it doesn't have oil and gas and gold. It doesn't have the resource curve that Russia has. Therefore, it depends on hundreds of millions of very clever Chinese people, and they are very clever entrepreneurs, making things and doing services. So I see before my eyes every time I go to Beijing this middle class emerging. At the moment, it's still small, it's still weak, it's still dependent on the state. But in the long term, I think Karl Marx may well be proved right. And you will gradually get a middle class, and you're beginning to see it already emerging, which will want to defend its own interests. So I'm a short-term pessimist, but a long-term optimist.
Against the wall there, yeah.
My question is, when do you think we should help opposition movements grow and support them with technology or whatever? And when do you think we should not do this in the interest of stability and safety? And I'm, for example, thinking about a country like Egypt, because I don't think it would be very helpful if we had like someone like the Muslim Brotherhood running the country now in that kind of a situation which we have in the Middle East.
Right. So the question was about Egypt. Some of you may remember that in Bush's second term, I don't know if you remember, I'm sure you remember this, Condi Rice said, well, we haven't got everything exactly right in our first term, fair comment, and now we're going to have a great democracy promotion initiative. And she gave a great speech at the American University in Cairo, and Egypt was going to be the model example. Remember this? And they were going to put lots of money and magazines and scholarships and, you know, da-di-da. And then the Muslim Brotherhood did rather well in the elections, and they totally retreated from this for fear that Islamists would come to power. And I think they were dead wrong. I think what is going to happen in Egypt when finally something breaks, maybe not with al-Baradei, but maybe in 5 years or whatever, is going to be a hell of a lot worse. If you suppress an Islamist movement like that, it's going to become more radical, more angry, more militant. So I would take the risk of supporting opposition movements, even of that kind, even like the Muslim Brotherhood. And when Hamas wins the election, you have to say, well, yeah, Hamas won the election, and now we have to deal with this movement which won an election. And this is very difficult because it's like Sinn Féin and the IRA. Or it's like, let's not forget, the ANC and its armed wing, Controversive. Yeah? You have to deal with these political movements. So I would say I cannot offhand think of any real situation in the world where non-violent, I emphasize, non-violent democracy promotion would be inappropriate.
Did you want to follow up on that question? Yes. Yeah, then I'll come to you. Sorry. But I could see his hand go straight up as you said.
One thing that comes to mind is Algeria and Islamic Salvation Front, which was denied effect.
Right.
And that really spiraled out of control, and we have
right.
One could argue, a low-intensity civil war. What would you think would have happened had the Islamic Salvation Front been allowed to take over and have the responsibility of government?
Right. Well, of course, that's the counter-argument, which is the famous one man, one vote, once, and then never again. I'm not an expert at all on the detail of that case. I mean, I don't think, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood case is like that. And I think that actually, by dealing politically with these movements, on the whole, you would tend to strengthen the political arm against the violent arm. That would be the general principle.
In the front row here.
You mentioned that Germany is becoming more Eurosceptic, and Germany, of course, is also most pro-Russian country in Europe.
Right.
Do you envisage a situation, a hypothetical situation in future, where Europe might find more common ground with Russia than it finds with the United States, and what the consequences would be?
Well, I mean, what you say is true of a lot of sentiment in Germany, and it's personified, of course, by Gerhard Schröder and his truly outrageous behavior of negotiating this pipeline deal and then a few weeks later going off to be its extremely well-paid chairman. And even our politicians don't quite go that far. So,
don't be sure.
Yet, anyway, yes, quite.
We don't know entirely where the 15 million has come from.
But what? So I mean, I don't think we're going to get to Rapallo, because Germany, although it's the biggest and richest country in Europe, is still only one among 27, and the whole of Eastern Europe is in there, and so I think that's going to be sort of self-limiting. And by the way, as I said, Russia is not a three-dimensional superpower. It's a one-dimensional regional power. So I don't think it has sufficient power to convert the loyalty. But I don't think there's anything automatic about the transatlantic alliance continuing for the next 20 years. The West, as we knew it in the Cold War, no longer exists. There's nothing automatic. And the interesting thing here is that Obama is both the most European president the United States has ever had and the least European. The most European in the sense that he thinks government is good. He wants to do universal health care. He believes in social justice. He's a European like us. The least European in the sense that he has virtually no personal emotional relationship to Europe. He says this himself. Europe is not a special place for him, or if it's a special place, it's not a specially nice place.
Right, you would think so if you had a cousin in Slough, which he does.
Now, I have to say, John, that since John Betjeman, that's the most anti-Slough remark I've heard. Let's say a word for Slough here, which is now one of the largest Polish and I believe, is it Sri Lankan cities in Europe? I think it's right. Anyway, but so there's absolutely, and if you talk to the people in the Obama administration, it's incredibly interesting because their first instinct is absolutely not to say, so where is Europe on this? It's to look around the world and say, where's India, or where's Brazil, or where's South Africa, or how can we handle this one, or maybe China? And their attitude to Europe is incredibly hard-nosed. It's what can you do for us today? So I think that is a challenge for us, much more than Russia.
And one other word they say is who speaks for Europe? And your friend, Mr. Rompuy.
My friend, thank you, John. Yes, well, yes, I wouldn't go quite that far. You know, Henry Kissinger, everybody quotes him. I make a collection of these famous quotations that nobody ever said. And one of them is Henry Kissinger, you say Europe, but which number should I call? There is absolutely no evidence that Henry Kissinger ever said this. It was never documented. And so finally, when I couldn't find any such evidence, I wrote to Kissinger. And I said, you're said to have said this. Where did you actually say it? And he wrote back this wonderful letter which said, I think I must have said it in about 1973. So clever.
I wish I had.
Yes, yeah. It's very clever, so I must have.
In the corner there, and then you three, and then we'll have to be thinking, and you four. That we're at 5 and 6. Goodness. Let's take a cluster, and then we'll make sure that people get a chance.
I love Europe. I love the idea of Europe, but it seems to me that when there's an opportunity to influence on the world stage, that Europe can often go missing. And the most recent example in my mind is actually the banking crisis. And there's a lot of major international institutions and across the EU, and it would seem to me an opportune moment to rewrite, in a sense, a new paradigm in how we manage our accounts and global rules and regulations and so forth. But it seems to me again that there wasn't really a unifying voice coming from Europe, and we've waited for Obama to place regulations on his banking system before Europe has actually done anything itself. Stuff has been done, and there has been additional money pumped into systems. And again, it was a real opportunity, I think, for the EU to influence and to shape how we do business across the world.
We'll park that and respond to it in a moment. There's one here. I'm going to take 3, and then I'll take another 3.
Can I ask you what your views on Italy are, and what you think the impact of its likely downfall will be on Europe, if any?
Its likely downfall?
Yes. I'm very, very pessimistic on both.
Right, okay. The downfall of Italy.
And just in glasses, that's the last one. Yes, you, why not? I've got 2 glasses, but I'll take yours.
Right, okay. I wanted to ask, how Europe can possibly get it together to begin to punch somewhere near the weight it should be punching.
Well, I mean, 3 interlinked questions.
Yeah.
After all, if Italy downfalls, we're all in a lot of trouble.
Yes. I actually think that Silvio Berlusconi, you know, there's they are connected because everyone is in search of this famous thing called the European public sphere, which is, you know, where you'd rarely have European media and all Europeans are actually talking about the same thing. Well, of course, we are all talking about the same thing. It's the United States. You know, American politics is our soap opera. America is the one thing all Europeans have in common. But now we have Silvio Berlusconi. And he has actually, you know, all Europeans know about Silvio Berlusconi. We all laugh about him. We all follow him. So it's added greatly to the gaiety of nations and European unity, which is a great achievement, I think. And it is a very rum situation. I think downfall is perhaps slightly overstating it, I have to say. So long as the economy somehow goes on working, you know. Right. Well, you know, how many governments has Italy had since 1945? It must be over 60, I think. There are countries where life goes on somehow in spite of politics, and Italy has a great tradition of that.
He's had the longest running government since the end of the Second World War.
Only because they changed the voting system.
Yeah.
Yes, they changed the voting system.
And let's not forget,
and the law.
Italian companies have outstripped Britain in supplying generating sets to China, which was a market we absolutely dominated. And now the Italians are, you know, they're fantastic manufacturers. Yeah. It's an extraordinary thing. It's this wonderful country of city-states. Each of one does what it wants to do, and they call themselves Italy.
Yeah. I mean, but what is interesting is it actually goes to the other questions about regulation and getting it together, which is it's just amazing what you can get away with once you're inside the European Union. I mean, if you'd had a country that was just applying to join the European Union, and that country was Berlusconi's Italy, it would never have been admitted. I mean, you know, not in a month, but once you're inside, particularly if you're a big country, you can get away with murder.
But actually we had Italy in when the mafia were really in the ascendant, and the criminal classes were really in control.
But then
you could argue...
Because they were a founding member. In other words, the point at which European sort of discipline really works is the point when you're trying to get in. As soon as you've got in, you do whatever you like. The regulation point, I mean, this is a really interesting one because everything the critics of European monetary union said turns out to have been true. All the problems that they predicted in the late 1990s are now upon us. And the question is, can we find solutions? We did put the cart before the horse, right? And now can we somehow get the horse in front? Europe getting its act together, here's our problem. Europe was driven forward for 60 years by a series of traumas in real people's lives. So Kohl and Mitterrand still remembered the Second World War. They were children of the Second World War. They remembered occupation. They remembered defeat. Then you had a generation which went through the Cold War, which experienced communism. You had these series of traumatic experiences. And now we don't have enough traumas left. That's to say, Europe is a victim of its own success. And the challenges we face are not immediate ones. They're not matters of life and death in our own lives, today or tomorrow, for most of us. Most Europeans are living reasonably comfortably and reasonably well in a sort of slow decline. And the challenges are these big, big things out there, the rise of China and Brazil and India and climate change. But the problem is these are too sort of remote and vague and abstract and long-term, really to focus minds. So I think this is a really good question, and it actually requires, sorry to come back to this, but leadership of a high order to explain why these things are actually urgent when there isn't a Kalashnikov pointing at your head.
I'm going to have to take, I think, probably the last three. I don't know, where is my controller? What do you think? Right. We'll take that one and the guy in specs here, and you at the back. So that makes the three. Great.
Thanks. I want to pick up with the image of European failure that you mentioned earlier in Copenhagen, and the image of the US and the basic countries sitting down to do the deal. There is an alternative perspective on that, which is that in many ways Copenhagen was a long-term European success, where you had a US president who had moved 180 degrees from where the US was 10 years ago. You had China willing to talk about becoming a low-carbon economy, a concept which China itself says was invented in Europe. And you had an outcome that actually reflected much of what Europe wanted. But my own view is that the crucial missing piece is that at the end of the day, Europe didn't really believe its own rhetoric when it came to reinventing its economy. And it didn't have the diplomatic clout to turn its incremental moves into a political alliance that could have isolated China or the US. And I think that what was really missing there was especially German leadership and the support of the Central and Eastern European countries, particularly Poland. And so my question to you would be, to what extent do you think Germany and Poland particularly will be prepared to support a new vision of European economic growth and align to that an active global Europe?
Good question. And then in the middle here.
Thank you. Hi, I was wondering if we could just return to Iran and Israel and the U.S. I agree with your comment that sanctions won't work, and China would probably never allow them seriously to happen. It would probably make everyone feel a little bit better in the U.S. to sanction Iran more, but it's not going to get the job done. Israel has a long-held policy of not allowing any other Middle Eastern state to acquire nuclear weapons. With that in mind, I was wondering if you could give us your thoughts on, if it's not going to be sanctions, how do you think this is going to end? What are the next few steps on the Iran proliferation issue?
And that's a big challenge. And the last at the back there, not least.
Thank you, I'll stand up. First, compliments to Tim on your article on Ryszard Kapuscinski. If there's anything else you'd like to say on that topic, I think I, for one, probably not the only person who would like to hear it. Second, you set great store by the growth of the bourgeoisie in China. Russia is now going through the growth of a middle class, in fact, for the second time. And there are people in Russia, including sinologists in Russia, who say China is only just embarking on its 1905. It's still got 1905 and 1917 to come. Do you think there's any truth in that?
Well, three great questions.
Three very good questions. In fact, four.
Right,
another one there.
Four, Kapuscinski.
So, and I'm really
Why
glad...
don't you deal with Kapuscinski straight away?
Can I take Kapuscinski at the end? Because
Right.
I want to finish on that, because I think I'm glad you mentioned it, and it sort of relates to the book. So on Copenhagen, your analysis is very precise, and I think that the Poles could, in time, be moved towards a low-carbon economy position. I think that the diplomatic clout foreign policy question is much more difficult for all the reasons we've been discussing, but also because, I say again, Germany is Europe's central power. And if you have a Germany which is now, as someone rather well put it, a second France, that is to say, you'll be European if it's convenient, if you can work through Europe, but if need be, you'll pursue your own national interest in your own way, then it's very difficult to see who's really going to pull the act together. So I am, I'm afraid, pessimistic on that score. Look, Iran, Israel, and all that, how long have we got? I mean, I would think, and this comes back to a point that John made, that one of the major motives for what Obama is doing is the fear that if we don't stop Iran getting the bomb, Israel will bomb Iran. And that would be such an obvious disaster from all possible points of view. So I would think that's a major motive for what Obama is trying to do. I assume that they are hoping with sanctions and containment and everything else they're doing to stop Iran clearly going over the threshold. In other words, they're imagining some sort of an ambiguous threshold outcome where the balance of the argument in Israel could just go against bombing, because it's actually very difficult for Israel to bomb on its own. So that, I think it's going to be brinkmanship for some years to come, slowing things down, fudging things, and so on.
Do you give any credence to the idea that Mossad have been gradually killing Iranian nuclear scientists? A number have disappeared in unfortunate circumstances.
I have no idea what they have been up, I have to say. I hope they don't use my passport. That's the only thing I would say. The Russia question, yes, I think so, but for the reason I gave, that Russia has the resource curse. I think the emergence of the bourgeoisie in Marx's sense, and therefore bourgeois democracy, is going to take longer in Russia because you have these massive natural resource interests, the oligarchs in cahoots with the state, as in Saudi Arabia. Now finally, Kapuscinski, I hope people have followed this story. I noticed John also blogged about it, which is a really important story, I think, and we might spend a moment on it, because here you have someone who was quite likely, if he'd lived a few more years, to win the Nobel Prize. The first person, quote unquote, non-fiction writer he would have been to win the Nobel Prize in half a century, more than half a century. And it turns out what a lot of us actually already thought, because this has not come as a revelation to many of us, that he made a lot of it up, that he fabulated, that he invented quotations or ascribed them to other people, altered the order of things, that all the dialogue of those, you remember the courtiers in the Emperor, the Haile Selassie book, were actually based on the language of 17th century Poland. Because he went back to read books about 17th century Poland and took their arcane court language. And this new biography, which I read with the Polish biography, documents that in great detail, and actually goes back and talks to Kapuscinski's original sources. I don't know if Lindsay would like to have that done to you, I must say. And I think he has stepped across a really important line. We all make mistakes, but let them be honest mistakes. If we're working under pressure in difficult circumstances, in foreign languages, we all make mistakes. But I can honestly say, I have never invented a quote. I have never altered the order in which things do. I mean, that is my first commandment. I may not have got it right, but we have to tell it as it is. We have to try and get the facts, which is why, and I hope people coming into journalism now and coming into writing reportage will not take Kapuscinski as their model. I have to say, he was a friend of mine, but they won't take him as a model. Do what is called in American writing courses creative nonfiction. Listen to that, creative nonfiction, hang on. But believe that facts are subversive, because I believe that. You don't have to make it up, because the things real people say are so fantastic and so wonderful. The things that actually happen are wonderful enough to make a great story. Let me, in closing, and in thanking John for his wonderful grilling, it's been like an hour and a half on Channel 4 News, say, which I've been watching for 30 years, say that this nearly happened to me with this title, because Facts Are Subversive, as you all know, is a quotation from I.F. Stone. the great American journalist. You all know that. You see, everyone nods assent. So when
no, we're nodding assent at the existence of I.F. Stone.
Good, right. But you, if I'd told you it was Izzy Stone,
let alone the existence of the quote.
Right. But if you'd said, if I told you Facts are Subversive came from Izzy Stone, you'd have said, yeah, sounds like him, right?
Yeah.
So I was about to say this in the preface to the book, and I thought, hang on, I better just fact check this. So I Googled it. Facts are Subversive, I.F. Stone. And I got an impeccable source. Unfortunately, the impeccable source was me, quoting it in my Guardian column, which you should never believe again. So I then went off, and I thought, that's not good enough, can't believe him. So I contacted two biographers of I.F. Stone, his editor, his daughter, and his son, who have a website of his work. None of them could find this quote. None of them could find it. They all said Izzy Stone might have said that, but I don't think he actually did.
And
so
unlike Henry Kissinger, he would have denied it.
Well, quite, exactly. Even if he'd said it, maybe. But anyway, it's a great line, but for now it's mine.
Yeah. Well, Timothy Garton Ash, what an experience. What a sensational evening. What a voyage. And so lyrical as the writing. To be able to conjure answers to all these questions. I feel like the naughty boy at the back of the class who really wants to be as good as the master and knows he never can be, hence the frustration and the naughty boyedness. But genuinely, it's been a fantastic privilege to be with you, and thank you very, very much for talking with us.